All right, guys, we're back. We have Mr. Brian Halbleib, the infamous Habitat Podcast co-host on the line. What's up, Brian?
How's it going today, my friend?
Oh, not doing too bad. I'm excited to talk some trees.
Absolutely.
We have what we call a three-peat, third-time offender, Mr. Lindsay Thomas Jr. on the line. Lindsay, how you doing, sir?
I am doing great, Jared. I am glad to be back with you guys.
Yeah, it's always good to talk and chat and run into you at the ATA show or wherever. And yeah, thanks for coming back on. We've been trying to record this tree planting episode for a while, but we're doing it now and we're excited to do it. So thank you for hopping on when we finally got around to calling you back. So
hey, I'm excited for y'all that y'all have, been around so long now. You're into your 200s in your episode count, and there's a lot to talk about that in deer habitat. And I know it keeps y'all busy. You do a great job of that. But yeah, I'm happy to be back. Thanks for having me.
Anytime. For those who might not know, you were on episode 29 and episode 83, where I'm sure you introduced yourself on there. But if you don't mind, could you give us a quick introduction on who you are, where you're from, what you do for a living, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I'm the Chief Communications Officer for the National Deer Association, which is, as you all know, a nonprofit deer conservation group. I've been there it'll be 20 years in September with this organization. Of course, it was QDMA when I came on board, and now we are the National Deer Association. And my job with them is doing communications, producing the magazine, the website, social media, our e-newsletter and email communications, video, the works. My team does all of that for the organization. And I work out of my home here in Georgia.
20 years.
Echo. It's crazy.
That's a long time.
It slips up on you. Like we were, saying, it's time flies and it slips up on you. So it's hard for me to believe it's been 20 years, but it's been 20 very good years for sure.
So what do you think? And it was QDMA, now it's NDA. What are some of the biggest changes you've seen over the 20 years as maybe a trend in the deer habitat world? We had this question asked to us yesterday on a podcast, and I'm just curious on what you've seen. You're immersed in it. Anything come to mind? And I didn't prepare you for this, so I apologize, but.
No, and it's one I've given a lot of thought to, because I've definitely seen some changes in deer habitat mindset among our members and among deer hunters. Just like in my time with communications, when I came to work here 20 years ago, it was to produce the magazine. That was what we had. We didn't have a website. We didn't do social media. There wasn't any social media. Facebook came along shortly after that, and Twitter and YouTube and some others. So, over time, communications has changed. We've spent more and more of our time on digital and less of it in print, but reaching more and more people in digital. But on the habitat side, in terms of how things have evolved in those 20 years, I can definitely tell you that, 20 years ago when I came to work for this organization, food plots were huge. Food plots were the thing. When you talked about deer habitat, that's what people wanted to talk about. What do I plant? How do I plant it? Etc. Not that they didn't talk about other things, but food plots was dominant. And the change that I've seen, the way I describe it, is essentially people learned how to do that, and they started looking beyond the food plots, literally looking into the fields and the woods edge, bordering the food plots and saying, hey, I can help with deer nutrition here in this plot. Can I do it out here also? And so we have, as an organization, shifted our education to respond to those questions, to share new information and new research that has come up about forest management and field management and prescribed fire, tree planting, all the other ways that you can increase improve deer habitat, increase deer nutrition, increase cover, increase fawn survival, do all the things we want to do to improve deer where we hunt, beyond something that we plant with a hand crank spreader and put fertilizer on. So that's the change I've seen. There's much more interest now in forest management, in fire, you know, building cover, encouraging native species without, you know, planting anything. So all of these additional techniques, that's the trend I've seen. Of course, people are still planting food plots. It's just that that's been the changes that originally when I started with this organization, you know, food plots was the big dog in the discussion. And now it's almost, you know, one of many topics that get covered anytime deer habitat comes up. I mean, I'd love to know the percent breakdown of your podcast. If you categorized every minute you spend talking about deer habitat, what would the pie chart look like in terms of food plots versus timber management, forest management versus, you know, native warm season grasses and field management and fire, things like that? I'd be interested to see. It's probably pretty diverse, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think so. Brian, what about you? I mean, I think we started off heavy in the food plots when we first started, because I think that's what a lot of new managers do too.
Sure.
But what are your thoughts, Brian?
Yeah, for sure. I think Lindsay nailed it. A lot of people start out there because, let's face it, it's easy and you get quick results. You know, you're not trying to take a large swath of land and turn it into switchgrass or something that may take 3 to 5 years or whatever it's going to be for whatever you're planning. So yeah, it's kind of nice to see that transition from everybody concentrating on food plots to a holistic approach of trying to make the entire property and give the herd, not just the deer, but turkeys and grouse and whatever else we're trying to manage for in different areas, give them everything they need.
That's a perfect point, Brian. It's an entry point. Food plots are. It's an easy entry point for most deer hunters into habitat management. I can do this, but as soon as you can do that, you realize you can do more.
Yeah, I just want to say you answered that question way more eloquently than I did yesterday. So well done. Well done. I think you've been doing this maybe 20 years or so. So we got you on here today. We want to talk trees. That's kind of on the forefront of a lot of folks' minds these days, including mine and Brian's, whether you're cutting them down or planting them. Today we're going to talk about planting them. But I saw your Instagram post yesterday about the National Champion Tree Program. That's pretty neat. I've never heard of that.
Fascinating.
Can you tell us about that and the fact that you're part of the program?
Actually, I'm not. What I'm doing
I mean,
is
you're into it, right? You're cataloging into it.
Yeah. So there's a group called American Forests that has what's called the National Champion Tree Program, and it's simply cataloging, you know, very large specimens of each species around the country. And they look at, it's not just, you know, girth, circumference. They also look at height. You know, there's several measurements they take to sort of determine what's a champion tree. It changes over time. New trees are discovered. Old ones, champions die, etc. I've been, you know, familiar with that, and it just hit me that I ought to start gathering that same information simply on my family's land. What are, you know, these aren't champion trees, champion, you know, in terms of an official like state or national champion, but they're the champion for our property. And so I said, I need to start collecting this information. Yeah, it's kind of pointless or useless information, I guess you might say. But when you are out there, you know, living and loving deer habitat, you get to know neat features that you have where you hunt. And big trees are part of that for me. I love trees. So I just decided to start collecting some of that. And the post was about a live oak that is on our farm that, as I mentioned in the post, I measured at 67 inches DBH, which is diameter at breast height. So that's 5.5 feet in diameter across. Wow. Literally, if you cut this tree down, you know, I could lay down on it and my feet and head would be supported. And it was 17.5 feet in circumference around. So, you know, that's the biggest tree on our farm for sure. I don't doubt, but I've got some others. We've got some big cypress down in the swamp. We've got some big slash pine down in the swamp that I'm going to measure. And it's just kind of a gee whiz neat thing for us to know, you know, as a landmark on our place, what's the biggest tree of any species out there, and kind of to recognize that.
Yeah, I thought it was neat. I mean, I'm a little biased when it comes to deer habitat stuff, but yeah, that's very neat. And I think Brian, we should have measured that big cherry tree on Mike's property in Ohio. You
Yeah,
remember that
was
thing?
crazy. Oh yeah, got a picture of it anyway.
Yeah, it was probably similar to the size of Lindsay's live oak there, I'd say.
Mm,
But yeah, it's big trees are cool. I don't care
They
who
are.
you are. That's cool.
That's
Yeah,
really it.
especially
They're cool. That's it.
especially when you put it in the context like you did about the history that that tree had probably been standing there for. It's pretty neat to think about that.
Yeah, someone on Facebook mentioned to me, who's a local historian, that our farm at one point had been a cavalry training camp during the Civil War,
Hmm.
and mentioned that they probably camped under that tree,
Yeah,
hung out there. So it's amazing to think about that.
crazy.
Wow. Yeah. Well, Lindsay, what's new with the National Deer Association? Let's catch up on that, and then we'll get into the meat and potatoes here. What you guys have going on these days?
There's a lot. There's always a lot going on. We rolled out our deer report here a couple weeks ago, the new deer report, which is our annual look at how are deer doing, how's the deer harvest looking, how, on a national scale, what does the deer population and deer hunting look like? And so Kip and his team put that together. And in fact, tonight at 7 p.m., Kip's going to do a live webinar going through the highlights of the deer report. We've been pushing that out on social media. I know by the time this episode hits, it will be over. But if anybody is interested in that and missed it, we will put that on our YouTube. We'll record it and put it on our YouTube channel. But the neat thing tonight at 7 when we go live is that people who are on the call will be able to interact and ask questions with Kip and his team. So we got that. We just rolled out a brand new Deer Steward Level 1 course. For those who aren't familiar, this is our sort of intensive training for folks who really want to know more about deer biology, deer habitat, and deer hunting. And we just, last year recorded a new course live. We went to Whitetail Properties, and the Whitetail Properties folks recorded that for us with their cameramen. And it's got Kip and Matt and Ben, Will Goldsby from Auburn University, Marcus Lashley from Florida, Bronson Strickland from Mississippi State, several other non-NDA folks who spoke as well. And anyway, so that we're rolling that out right now. We've actually got a discount going of 35% till we get the first 350 people signed up for that. So that's been something we're excited about. It's honestly the best version of Deer Steward Level 1 we've ever had. The video quality is the best. The topics are the best, and the speakers are the best we've ever put together. So excited about that. Legislative season is in right now. As many state legislatures are meeting as we speak. So Torin, who's our senior director of policy, that's keeping him hopping. For those folks who are in our mailing list and we have a physical address for you, we send out targeted e-blasts anytime there are state issues that pop up in your state, whether it's something we think you should support or something you should be opposed to as a deer hunter. So we're blasting those alerts out left and right every day right now. So it's kind of hot and heavy legislative season. Yeah, a lot going on. I'm flying to Louisiana Sunday to the Southeast Deer Study Group meeting that we go to every year, where a lot of deer science is shared. So I'm excited about that. Learn a lot about deer habitat research and biology. So yeah, a ton going on.
Yeah, well, we appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to speak for deer and habitat, Lindsay, and your team and all the guys at the NDA. You're doing all the things that Jared and I are trying to keep up with, keeping our properties managed and all the work that goes into that, plus going out and speaking for all of us. So I just can't thank you enough. And I know I can echo thousands of our listeners that would say the same thing to you. So appreciate it.
Well, thank you, guys. I mean, truth is, we can't do this without people like y'all. Both of you as individuals have helped this organization in a lot of ways over the years. Just, having me and other staff members on the podcast and helping us reach audiences. Y'all, Jared, you've participated in the field to fork hunts there at the Back 40 property in Michigan and seen some of the, you've been a hands-on volunteer there, helped with hunter recruitment. So yeah, both of y'all have been supporting members in a big way, more than just kind of, passive supporters. Y'all have been getting your hands dirty in backing us up. We couldn't do it without y'all.
Well, we're glad to do it. Appreciate it. So let's jump into our topic at hand here. We've heard from a lot of our listeners. They like to hear the mistakes that we've made, up front, so they can kind of avoid that when they're jumping into it. So maybe cover 3 to 5 of the planting mistakes that you see a lot of people making.
Okay, and I've seen people making them. I've made them myself. I've been planting trees since I was 10 years old. My dad got me and my brother Rand started early doing this. He was a farmer. He, planted the first food plot I ever saw there on our farm, and for deer. And it was just a simple cereal grain plot. But he was thinking about that. What can I do for deer and habitat? So we got into tree planting too. He took us along. Mostly, I think it was so that he'd have somebody to operate the post hole diggers, and it wasn't him. But he took us along, and we planted a lot of trees as young boys. So, I saw the mistakes that we made because, I'm 53 now. That was 43 years ago that I was helping plant tree seedlings, and I can go back and see some of those trees that are still living. I can also remember places we planted them where there are no trees now because we didn't do it right. So, real quick, I think we can sum up some of the big ones. One is not giving the tree enough space and sunlight. Sunlight and room is the number one thing you can do for a tree seedling to get it growing faster, to get it producing whatever it is you want it to produce faster, whether that's acorn mass, soft mass like fruit. Any kind of tree is going to grow faster and produce mass faster if it's got room to grow a big crown. A big crown means more limbs and more branch tips. That's where the flowers are produced. More branch tips means more flowers and more fruit. So room leads to a big crown, sunlight leads to growth. And so not providing that. I mean, when we first started, we go out and plant seedlings in places that we thought were cool places to hunt for deer, pretty woods, places, near deer stands. But these were shady forests, and no seedling is going to do well there. Many of them are going to die, and those that don't are simply going to struggle along for years and just continue to be a little spindly tree. A lot of times you hear scientists talk about, if you go ask, how long does it take a white oak to produce an acorn? The research on that is looking at white oaks in a forested situation. An oak seedling that grew naturally from an acorn in a forested setting and is trying to struggle against other trees to get up and reach some sunlight and reach an age and a size and a crown size that can produce some mass. And they'll tell you, it takes 50, 60, 100 years. Sure, in a shady, crowded setting like that, yes. But it is not the case when you give a tree room to grow and space to grow. I've seen trees, even white oaks, begin producing acorns in as little as 8 to 10 years. Some other oak species produce them even faster than that. So space and room is a huge one. Not giving them room to grow, that's a big mistake. And on that point, real quick, just to go into a little depth, not only the day you plant the tree, looking and going, does this tree seedling have room here? Is it far enough away from other trees you're planting? Is it far enough away from other trees that are there that day? But also kind of thinking future-wise. A mistake I've made and a mistake I've seen people make is planting a tree seedling under power lines. You're looking up, if you even notice the power lines that day, there's plenty of room over that tree seedling, right? The power lines aren't in the way, and it doesn't occur to you that might be a problem. But guess what? 10, 15 years down the road, that tree is going to start crowding those power lines. What's going to happen? The power company is going to come by and slice off half of it. So it's things like that. It is looking into the future when you plant that tree seedling and go, is this a good place to put this tree? Does it have room and sunlight now? And is it always going to have that room? Not using a tree tube. That's a mistake in my book. I'm talking about these plastic tree protector tubes. What that does is initially protects the seedling from rubbing and browsing by deer. Bucks will rub them. They'll browse those seedlings. Putting it in a tube, a 5 to 6 foot tall tube, protects them for those early years. But it also, what it does is put the seedling in a situation where it sees the sunlight at the top, and it goes for that. It puts its energy into vertical growth to reach that circle at the top. And so it gets on up out of deer browsing range sooner before it begins to produce horizontal limbs. So if you put a seedling in the ground that's, a couple feet tall and you don't put a tube on it, it's immediately going to start filling that space with horizontal branching. You don't want it to do that yet. Not only is it subject to being browsed by deer, you want it to go ahead and get up a little height on it before it begins to branch. That tube accomplishes those two things, protects it from browsing and rubbing, and gets it on up vertically before it begins to branch out. So it's above browse level. So I always recommend to use a tube. The studies done on that show survival rates are vastly increased. It acts a little bit like kind of a mini greenhouse, protects your seedling from snow, wind, being dry, kind of collects moisture in there. So those are very good to use. Another big mistake that I see people make, you tell people put your seedlings in space and in the open. And most people look around their property and go, where's an open space I can put a tree? It's a food plot. And so I see people go out in the middle of food plots and plant tree seedlings or right on the edge. And the problem comes in, it's a good open area, sure, but the problem comes in when you come back to disc your food plots and you're disking right up near or under the limbs of that tree as a seedling or in the future. And what you're doing is cutting roots. You have to think of the roots of a tree as just as important as the part you see above ground. And the root system is going to be almost as big, or at least as big around, as what you see above ground. The limb spread is going to be equal by the root spread underground. And most of the feeder roots are just under the surface. If you disc under that, you are stressing the tree. You are damaging the tree. You're impacting the tree's ability to pull in nutrients and moisture and stressing it out. Many times repeated disking like that, I've seen it kill trees. And if it doesn't kill them, they end up just kind of being stunted, slow growing, wounded looking trees. So, protect the roots. Don't put trees in a food plot where you're going to be disking underneath that tree in the future trying to grow food plots. It's really not a good pairing, because that tree is trying to pull nutrients and moisture from the soil. You put it right next to a food plot, they're competing with each other. I've seen trees in the middle of food plots and people plant them, but around the tree there's a bare area where nothing can grow. It's because the food plot crop is competing against the tree for moisture and nutrients. So, you shouldn't really set up that competition to start with. So those are three big ones. One more we can get into later is kind of a strategy thing, and that is just scattering them around. If you go out there and start looking for the open places to put a tree seedling where it's got lots of room and sunlight, that might be sort of random locations on your place that you hunt. And if you do that, you put the trees, they're going to do well there, but they're not placed with any kind of hunting strategy in mind. And that's a lesson I learned again over the years was, dang, I wish this tree or this group of trees had been over here instead of where it is from a hunting strategy standpoint. So that's something we can come back to, but just scattering them randomly, that's a mistake.
Well, that was awesome. I have a couple questions so far that going through there. Back to the oak trees real quick. Have you ever messed around with any other versions of oaks? You briefly mentioned them there, like a hybrid oak, columnar oak, something like that. Have you ever planted those, messed with those? Any idea on how long it takes for those to produce acorns? If given the correct treatment?
Yeah, so there are some recognized hybrids of oaks where a couple of native oaks have cross-pollinated. There's a lot of, when you get into it, this is kind of a rabbit hole you can go down, and people really enjoy getting into it. And there's some nurseries out there that sell some hybrid oaks. A few years ago, or actually several years ago, when we had the headquarters there in Athens, Georgia, Charlie Morris with Morris Nurseries gave us as a gift some hybrid oaks. And I planted them there on the QDMA headquarters, put them in a place with some good sunlight, and they did really well. They had one of them, I'm trying to remember, it was crazy. It was like 4 to 5 years and they were producing acorns.
Wow.
I don't remember which one it was. He gave us a bodacious burr, which is like a cross between a burr and you may know, what is it?
Give me a second. I know it's on their website.
It might be a cross between a burr and a white, or a burr and a swamp white. Anyway, I can't remember. There's another one he gave us that was a cross between an English and a white oak.
Yeah.
And that one did really well. That one took off, grew really well. produce a lot of acorns very young. That's supposed to be one of the benefits of hybrids, is they do produce acorns really early. The other one, the bodacious burr, did eventually begin producing some acorns. It seemed to be more susceptible to the heat and dry summers we have in Georgia. And I know that's not a fault of the tree. That tree does well, closer to its native range. It just didn't seem to tolerate heat and dry summers in Georgia as well as the other tree did. So
yeah, and that would make sense, being bur oak crossed with a little swamp white oak. So
yeah,
more of a wet feet-ish type.
and both of those are more Midwestern trees too. So whereas the white in English, white is native to the South too and Southeast. So it did well. So yeah, hybrids can be a good option to play around with and see how they do. Again, one of the lessons there is you do want to try to get trees that are either native or close to your climate range, or come from a nursery that's fairly close to it. One of the trees Charlie gave us did well, but the other one didn't. And again, I attribute that to it being a hybrid of species that generally don't live in this range and coming from a nursery in Michigan.
Yep.
So you want to be careful about that. Bottom line is, wherever you get your trees, whether it's from your state forestry agency or a local nursery, a nursery like Charlie's or Mossy Oak Native Nurseries or whatever, do some homework and make sure that it's coming from a region that's fairly close to your region and is a species that's, happy in your climate zone.
Yeah, I'm sure Dudley Phelps over there would have some good advice for us too over at the Mossy Oak Native Nurseries. Now, would you?
Dudley's an expert on the hybrids too. So definitely, if you ever want to go down that rabbit hole, talk to Dudley.
Is there any disadvantages to using a hybrid or planting these hybrid oaks that we're talking about?
I'm not aware of any. My general feeling is I prefer native trees to non-native trees for obvious reasons. So I guess I would just say, as long as kind of all the components of the hybrid are native species, you shouldn't have any trouble. So no, I'm not aware of any disadvantages, again, except for taking into account climate and soils that could be detrimental to a particular hybrid.
All right, appreciate that. I have about 40 of them in little pots right to the right of me over here in the basement. So
what kind are they?
They're just, all I know is they're hybrid. My buddy sent me some acorns. He found them in Illinois, and then I found some other ones here in town, and I know they produce a ton of acorns at a young age because the trees were placed there as landscaping by this place where there's a bunch of shops. And I cannot tell you the amount of acorns. I was sitting there on the phone one day just looking. I'm like, those are oak, it's an oak leaf, oak tree. And I scooped a bunch of those up too. So I'm not exactly sure to trace back the genealogy, if you will, all the way back, but some sort of hybrid. English, probably columnar, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it can be. That's why I kind of say it's sort of an obscure branch of tree knowledge that not many folks go into, because it can be difficult to determine exactly what a hybrid is. They find these trees in the woods that are, kind of not really a swamp white oak and not really a white oak and not really, looking at the leaf characteristics and the bark and the acorn characteristics, and people can kind of determine, well, this must be a hybrid of this and this. But it's not always clear, and it's not always clear, what you're going to get when you grow those. But it's always on your own place or somebody else's. If you see a tree that produces a ton of acorns, particularly if it seems to do it consistently across years, that's a pretty good tree. I'd collect some acorns and be growing them, because some research done at the University of Tennessee showed that not every white oak is going to be a great producer. It's actually a very small percentage of all your white oaks out there that are excellent producers. And it's the number that Craig Harper's team came up with was that 39% of the oaks they studied produce 70% of the acorns every year. So, wow. Some oaks are just genetically, individually not good producers. All of them are going to be intermittent and inconsistent to some extent. You're not going to have a great acorn crop every year. But if you can pick the trees that are individually consistent producers year to year, yeah, I'd be grabbing acorns and planting them too.
Is there much of that going on naturally, Lindsay, with hybrids in nature? Or do they kind of just pollinate what they're supposed to pollinate, I guess is what I'm
Mostly
asking.
they just, yeah, mostly they just pollinate what they're supposed to, otherwise we wouldn't have a tree that is universally recognized as a white oak.
Right.
And one that's universally recognized as a red oak, et cetera. But, I don't know. I don't really know the conditions. This would be a good question for Dudley. The conditions under which hybridization happens and how frequent
Okay.
it is. I don't think it's common, but it does happen, and it does produce, some trees that are unique and have some unique properties.
Great. And then real quick, tube versus a cage. You mentioned the tube to get it up out of the ground, promote that vertical growth better than the cage. Will you go back and cage a tree after it leaves the tube, or will you leave the tube on all the time and then let it protect itself till you're ready to pull it off and the tree gets too big in diameter? Or what are your thoughts there?
So what we do, we use the tube. Again, you want to get about the 5 to 6 foot tall model. Otherwise, it's not going to protect deer browsing. I mean, if they've got smaller tubes, 2, 3, 4 feet, but that comes out too soon and out the top, and a deer can browse them. I leave them on until the trunk of the tree is starting to fill up the tube. That is so well after the trunk has come out of the top and the tree is, well on up out of there and growing limbs and taking off and maybe even sometimes producing acorns. The tube stays on, in my opinion, to protect bucks from rubbing it, because bucks will, like I said, they'll rub them. It doesn't always kill a tree, as y'all know, when a buck rubs them, but sometimes it will. Plus, it's stressful to the tree. I'd just rather not have a buck rubbing those trees. So if you keep the tube on, it protects it. If when you initially put the tube on, you drive a stake in the ground to support both the tube and the seedling. You may need to leave that stake on there as well for a while. Sometimes the tree, when it has put that energy into the vertical growth, by the time it comes out the top, the trunk may be a little bit spindly and thin. And if you take the tube right off, wind can blow it over real easy. It may end up being, falling over. So leave the tube, leave the stake in place, let the tree grow on up. By the time it starts to touch the tube, in other words, begin to fill it up, that's when you want to remove it, because when the tube and the trunk are touching, moisture accumulates, dirt accumulates, insects, even invasive insects like gypsy moths and emerald ash borers and other things will overwinter inside those tubes when it's in that condition, that close, tight, restricted space in there. So once the trunk starts to touch the tube, take it off. But at that point, it can support itself. It can even tolerate buck rubbing. You shouldn't need at that point to have a cage around it. Now, can you do the cage instead of the tube? You can, and the cage will keep the deer from browsing and rubbing it, but it won't provide those kind of greenhouse advantages I mentioned of the tube actually protecting and encouraging the vertical growth of the tree.
And if your tree is already taller than a tube, when you get it, say you get a 2 or 3 year old apple tree that's 5 or 6 foot tall, would you go cage then at that time, or would you?
At that point,
okay.
You just use the cage just to keep bucks from getting up and browsing and rubbing.
Yeah, I tell you what, there's deer still find a way with those cages, and you get a branch that gets even close to the edge of that cage, and they're jumping up there, nipping it off. I've had cages go missing on apple trees, find them 50 yards away. Yeah, so to your point, those bucks can be, or does can be rascals.
Well, and you got, people who live in black bear country can have bears climbing apple trees and breaking them down. I remember someone wrote an article for us years ago about taking an old tire and filling it with nails. So it's like a spiky collar, and putting that around the apple tree so bears wouldn't climb it and break the limbs. But
not a bad
I don't
idea,
have that problem,
honestly.
thank goodness.
Yeah, we don't have any bears down here, but up north there's some bears, that's for sure. All right, moving right along here. Let's go. We covered some great mistakes. You listed 5 or 6 great mistakes I'm learning today. Tree planting tips. This could be a vast topic, but I guess general tree planting tips that come to mind, and I don't care if they're obvious. Let's just make sure we cover them. We got a lot of new listeners coming through on here too sometimes. So let's start with the basics.
Okay. So like a lot of times the way we do this, we're ordering tree seedlings from, say, the Georgia Forestry Commission here in our state. They come as bare root seedlings in a bag. They are, there's a little bit of soil or root protectant in there. You want to get those planted pretty fast. If they are bare root damage is the number one way you will harm your seedlings. Whether that's a growing tree that you damage with a disc harrow, or a seedling you pull out of the ground to transplant, or, those roots are critical. And once that bare root seedling is in that bag that you get, if they dry out, the seedling's going to die. So you got to get that in the ground pretty quick. You don't need to dig a deep hole. You don't want the seedling to, if the dirt settles and the seedling sinks and the roots are that much further below ground level, the roots need oxygen. So you want that root ball to stay up near the surface. You're going to cover them, obviously, but you don't want to bury them deep underground. So don't dig a deep hole in backfill. That dirt that you've loosened will tend to settle and create, a bowl, and the tree sinks deeper. So only basically look at your tree seedling, or if it's in a planter, you've grown that in a pot, look at the root ball that you pull out of the pot. How big is it? You really only need a hole as big as you need to accommodate either that plug of dirt, that root ball, or the tap root that's on that seedling. Put it in there, backfill with the native dirt. You don't need to put anything special in there, just the dirt that's on the site. That tree needs to go ahead and get acclimated to your native soil, so don't put any special treatments in there. And that's it. Stake it, tube it, and you're ready to go. Obviously, you're looking for a good site. Don't put trees that in a site that's too wet. If it's not a tree that's adapted to wet soils, don't put it on the top of a high, dry hill, sandy dirt. If it's not a tree that's not adapted to dry dirt, sandy soils. Put them in a good site. Put them in with some good open space. Don't fertilize. We did this early on. My dad, of course, was a farmer, and farmers know anything you put fertilizer on things, it grows faster. So Dad just thought that must apply here too. And we poured fertilizer around tree seedlings we had just planted. We killed a lot of them that way. They don't need it. The homework has been done on this, whether it's a seedling, whether it's an older tree. Particularly seedlings, you can damage them, burn them with too much fertilizer, so it's really not worth it. Give them the sun, give them the space, keep the competitors from crowding them, growing up on them, cut the vines off, etc. Let them have full sunlight and full space, and that's really all you've got to do, other than choosing a site with good, moderate soil fertility, and not too wet, not too dry. So let's
All right,
see.
hold on. I got some questions there, and I've made none of those mistakes before, I promise. So wish I would have had this podcast about 5 years ago. With those bare root plants, the roots need oxygen. That's very interesting. You can't leave any roots out of the ground when you plant. It may seem like a stupid question, but they come in like this big root ball mess, if you will. Do you do any trimming or worry about how they're oriented or any of that with that bare root tree prior to planting?
No, not really. These seedlings that and I assume it'd be this case in many other nurseries that I've seen. I've been to the Mossy Oak Native nurseries before and seen how they work. That was a nice visit. It operates much like many of the forestry commissions that produce seedlings as well, where they've got a system for producing these out in an open field. They've got a machine that comes along and uproots them gently without ripping the roots out, remove the soil. So you don't generally have a giant taproot. If you've grown your own in a pot, and if you've left it in the pot too long, particularly an oak that's trying to put down a taproot, you may see that taproot coiled around the bottom of the pot. That tells you you've left it in there in that container too long anyway. So I've really never done that. I've never dealt with trimming or pruning a root. I probably wouldn't do it, just because, again, root damage is the number one way that you stress and kill tree seedlings and older trees too. It's just a critical organ as in the tree's survival. So I'd probably err toward not damaging roots, not pruning them. A true tree expert, particularly when you get into finicky trees like apples and others might say something different. But when you're talking about, hey, I ordered 100 white oak seedlings from the Forestry Commission, we're mass production here. We're not pruning and worrying over trees a whole bunch. It's dig a hole, plant a tree, dig a hole, plant a tree. So no, I don't generally, do anything with the roots there. Get it in the ground, cover the roots, not too deeply. Yes, all the roots need to be covered. If they are exposed, they dry out and they're dead. And so that root dies and no longer contributes to supporting the tree. Get them in the dirt, get them covered, and get them growing.
Good point. I got a follow-up question on, this happens to me. It seems like every year I get a box of trees in the mail when I'm not expecting them. And I've got to be at the school for my daughter's play 3 nights in a row or something. What can we do to keep those trees from being harmed if we can't get to them right away?
Yeah, and that's a good point. There's been times when, we've ordered trees and the bag shows up and you can't plant that day. You got to wait till the weekend or it's raining or whatever. Put them somewhere cool and dry and shady. Get them out of the sun. Don't put that box or that bag out in the sun where they'll heat. Find a closet in the barn or wherever under a shed. Put them in there where it's shady. You can actually do, I've seen people do what's called healing them in, where you maybe scrape out a shallow hole in the dirt in a shady corner under a barn somewhere and literally lay those seedlings in that hole, cover them over with loose dirt, sprinkle a little water on it, and put the bag over it, make sure they're shaded, cool, and damp, and they've actually got dirt on them. So if you got a bag or a box full of literally bare root seedlings, and it's going to be more than a couple days, you can put them in a small hole and cover them with just a little loose dirt until you can plant them. But yeah, absolutely don't let them dry out. Don't let them get hot, and keep them damp. The bags that I get from the Forestry Commission, there's usually some kind of like a gel or soil, type stuff in there on the seedlings, on the roots, just to, again, help keep moisture in there. They're not completely bare and completely dry, but they're also not in dirt. So yeah, that's a good point. Just take good care of them, keep them damp, keep them cool until you can get them in the dirt.
Do you ever worry about you ever heard of J rooting, where like you plant the tree and the taproot might be a J because you put it in the hole wrong? You ever heard of that term before?
Yeah.
Okay.
When you get oak seedlings, it will, if they're bare root, it'll have a main taproot and a bunch of feeder roots coming off of that. And that's, again, when I say, if you hold up your seedling and it's got a taproot on it that's 2 feet long, dig your hole 2 feet deep, to accommodate that entire taproot, so that you're not coiling it up or curdling it to get it in the hole. You don't need to go any deeper than that, but go deep enough to accommodate the entire taproot and then fill it in.
Okay.
You don't really need to go wider with your hole either necessarily than the roots extend or the root ball size. Just kind of get in there and get it going.
Awesome. Okay. Well, that was very in depth. How about some other tips? I know we kind of sidebarred you there with a bunch of questions, but this is great, Lindsay. So what else you got?
Again, like I said, looking around at your site and asking yourself, is this a good place to put a tree? Is there a power line? Is there some other big tree that's dominating a lot of the sun there, particularly from, northern and western exposure, that you're not willing to cut down? Maybe find a better place. You want that tree having 100% sunlight if you can give it to it. So, looking at the site, looking at, look at how much soil or how much area the tree has to grow roots into. I look at, developments, malls or whatever, where you got asphalt and they go out there with a little 5-foot diameter circle of dirt and they put an oak tree in it. There's just, that tree's not going to do well. And you always see these trees struggling, thinning out and dying in just a few years because they put it in a place where it just can't grow a good root system. So look at issues like that. Is there something nearby that affects where that tree can grow its roots, and it would limit that. So look at the situation and make sure you're putting it in a good situation. In terms of planting tips, going back to the big picture I mentioned before, and that is your hunting strategy too. you really, before you plant a tree, you ought to be looking at the map of the whole place and going, how will this tree affect my future hunting? If this is a fruit producer, a mass producer that's going to be an attraction to deer one day, are you putting it in a place where the attraction can benefit your hunting strategy? One of the mistakes we made early was planting seedlings where there was good sunlight along roads and other places, and they ended up kind of strung out and scattered. There's nothing wrong with that. They're still going to produce well and produce nutrition, but from a hunting strategy standpoint, the attraction is kind of scattered. Now what we try to do is do small orchards, putting a small group of persimmons in one area, a small group of crab apples, small group of white oaks, whatever it is, in one area, and thinking, okay, down the road, this will be an area I can set, will be a very good bow stand right here, or very good rifle stand, whatever. So think about that. We all look at the map of our property and think about the hunting infrastructure, how we travel, where the wind's blowing, where the bedding areas are, how the deer move, how to cut them off. Well, your tree orchards ought to fit into that strategy just as much as a new food plot or a bedding area, a travel route, whatever. Make it make sense with your hunting strategy, because 10 years from now, when those persimmons are pouring persimmons on the ground and deer are coming, are you going to be able to hunt it effectively? So that's another planting tip that doesn't really have anything to do with actually putting a tree in the dirt. It's the big picture strategy.
Yeah, that's one that we can definitely have your back on. We know about that and tend to relay that message strongly through as well. I mean, I could think every one of my tree stand locations on my property, there's a fruit or mash tree within that 20 to 30 yard mark, or a couple of them. If you're on your little orchards, do you ever use a clover around the bottom? I know not something you want to disc or till in the future, or even spray herbicide by, but do you put any sort of clover in there to put nitrogen in the ground like a legume, or do you not worry about it?
No, we don't plant. Like I said, I don't mix food plots and tree seedlings. It's just, because to manage food plots, you're going to be you need to disc sometimes, and applying lime and fertilizer and other things. It's just better to do them in two separate places.
Perfect. What about this? How about 3, I want to say like idiot proof trees to plant without being mean, but like 3 trees to plant that Jared wouldn't fail on for the on average, maybe in the South, and maybe if you could recommend one up here too, that'd be cool. What are your thoughts on that? Anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, so there are, the oaks are fairly foolproof. If you follow those other tips I'm talking about, where you treat the roots right and you plant them right, you put them in a good spot, and you give them sunlight and room to grow, the oaks are pretty foolproof. They're hardy. They do pretty well. There are some native fruit bearing trees that are pretty no nonsense. In the South, for me, it's crab apples and persimmons. We have a native southern crab apple, and then just a native persimmon, which I think y'all got persimmons where y'all are. You don't have a southern crab apple, but you probably have a native apple of some type, native crab apple. Those are, again, pretty foolproof. You got a lot of lesser known trees that I like to do, that I've messed around with, that aren't sort of the big stars when it comes to whitetail attraction, but still play roles. Red mulberry is a good one that I like to do. Black gum is a pretty common eastern tree that's a good wildlife tree. Dogwoods, pawpaws, there's others. Anyway, I like to mess around with all of them. They all produce fruit or of some type and have benefits, but your oaks are pretty no nonsense. And for me, like I said, persimmons and crab apples. You get into, a lot of folks get into apples, improved apple varieties, and even improved pear varieties for deer, and those can be great. But for me, that's something that you need to understand is another level of maintenance. People that do apples will tell you need to prune them manually. You may need to control insects. You may need to control funguses and blights. and other things that will attack these improved apple varieties and improved pear varieties. So it's something you put a little more time into, and you have to be willing to do that and understand that, you know, they're great for deer attraction, but that's high maintenance, and you better have the time and the interest in being, you know, an orchard keeper for those species. Whereas I can go out here and put native persimmons and crab apples out just like in an orchard, give them room, give them space, do all the tips we talked about with tree tubes, and I don't have to mess with them again, other than preventing other trees and weeds from ever competing with them again. They're going to fruit, flower, take care of themselves. They deal with diseases. They handle most of that stuff. They're pretty tough and hardy, and you know, they're low maintenance. So that's where you just need to understand that difference between those improved apple varieties. Again, good deer attraction, but high maintenance, and you need to decide which one you want there.
Good points.
And just in
back,
general, let me say this too, and Brian, I know you got a question, but
no, go ahead.
In general, when we start talking about which trees to plant, the first place to start, I think, is to look at the place you're hunting and ask, what do you have and what do you not have? So for example, in your hardwoods, if you got lots of white oaks and you got plenty of white oak acorns falling, you don't need to plant more white oaks probably. If you don't have many red oaks, I'd fill in with red oaks. Both families, you know, there's a white oak family, there's a red oak family, and most oaks fall into those two categories. So you want some good representation from both families for a lot of reasons. White oaks tend to fall earlier. They're more attractive to deer, but they don't last as long on the ground. Red oaks aren't as initially attractive to deer as white oaks when they go compete against each other, but red oak acorns last longer on the ground and will be around in winter after the white oak acorns are gone. So they both have advantages, and you want some of both. If you look across your property and you've got a lot of white oaks but no red oaks, now you know what you need to plant. You don't need more white oaks, you need some red oaks, or vice versa. Same thing with fruit trees. If you look across your property and there's not many soft mass bearing trees, fill in with some crab apples and some persimmons, mulberries, some other soft mass producers, plums, pears, whatever that might be. But again, if you go out there and man, there's persimmons everywhere, you don't need to buy or plant persimmons. So that's kind of the first guide I look at in determining what you want to plant where you hunt is what do you not have?
That's why we had you on, because that was the exact question I was going to ask you, was getting back to the preparation stage. You know, do you recommend somebody trying to fill in the lowest hole in the bucket if they're missing this or missing that? But you nailed that for sure. One thing I see a lot of people doing is thinking they're going to order 3,000 trees and get them all on the ground. You know, kind of give us some tips on, you know, keeping your head and maybe spending a little more money and buying some more quality trees over quantity.
Yeah, you want to get the number right. You know, this takes, again, we're kind of jumping around in the order of things. I should have started kind of with some of the big picture stuff, like looking at your map and determining your hunting strategy and that kind of thing. But also, you know, this goes to your question, look at your map, look at your property, and find out not only what open areas do you have where you want to plant trees, but can you create some new ones? Can you create some new openings where you want to plant trees? So kind of determine where you're going to be putting them and look at the size of those. In general, with oaks, you'll hear people talk about a 30-20-10 rule. And generally what that means is oaks, you want to have about 30 feet apart from each other. Fruit trees like crab apples and persimmons and others, you want to have about 20 feet apart from each other. And then 10 would be small shrub-like things, like we have a tree here in the South called a Chickasaw plum. That's a native plum. I love that. It's a great thicket-forming plum, produces a little soft mass plum in the summer that wildlife eat, makes cover, makes forage, but it's more of a shrubby tree. It doesn't need to be 30 feet apart. You know, those are more 10 feet apart. So if you're going to be planting oaks, for example, and you look at your area where you want to put trees, and you're imagining these are all about 30 feet apart from each other, that kind of tells you, you know, you can do some math there and figure out about how many seedlings you need to fill that space. You definitely, if you go out there and order 1,000 tree seedlings and you end up putting them too close to each other because you ordered too many, again, you're putting them all in a situation to fail, because they're going to be competing against each other for sunlight, soil moisture, and nutrients, and that's not what you want. In fact, many times I think 30 feet is not enough between oaks. But the thing to remember is, though, over time, you may come in and remove some of those. So 30 feet ends up being a good rule across the long haul, because over time, your orchard, you'll see them even 30 feet apart. They're going to start growing toward each other and start, once they begin to touch limbs, they're running out of room. And at that point, you would be monitoring these and going, man, this one over here seems to produce more acorns every year. It seems to produce more consistently whereas this one over here, I haven't seen produce an acorn ever. Guess which one you're going to cut down to give room to the others. So, you'll eventually want to cull some of these to give room to the others. And that's where, getting the spacing right helps.
Yeah, that's a great couple of points there. That's a good segue into my last question for you too, is the maintenance. You're talking about going in and maybe having to remove some or pruning. How often are you checking on these? Or is it once a year, twice a year? And what kind of steps are you taking to maintain them?
It's about 365 times a year. That's how many I would do it if I lived on the property. I love looking at trees. We all do this. You're on your place. You like riding or walking around and seeing how things are growing. How's that food plot looking? Sometimes we overdo it and walk through areas we shouldn't be looking at, but we're tempted. All farmers want to look at their crops. And whether it's a food plot, whether it's an oak tree, we want to see how they're doing. So, yeah, it's an addiction to me to be looking. But, at least once a year, if you live a long way from your property, go and evaluate your trees and see what's happening. Are there other trees nearby beginning to compete with sun? Are they beginning to, run out of crown space, which basically is just simply limbs touching limbs? When they begin to touch each other, trees detect each other and have a way of beginning to grow upwards when they're bumping into somebody else. That's why, you walk into a crowded forest and look up, and, you can literally see where the limbs all kind of stop touching each other, and each tree's kind of holding its own in its own little space, and they don't go any further. They don't tend to grow, into each other. They tend to stop when they run into something. So don't allow that to happen. If they're running into each other, particularly if a tree you planted is running into a tree you don't need, like in the South, it'd be a fast-growing sweet gum or a fast-growing pine or a fast-growing beech tree or something like that, something you don't need. Get rid of the tree you don't need and don't let it block the tree you want. Vines too can be a problem. You'll see vines, whether it's native vines like greenbrier, growing up that tree you've provided, whether it's non-native stuff like honeysuckle, or even worse, invasives like kudzu. We've got other invasives here. We're now dealing with a thing called Japanese climbing fern, which I hope y'all never see. But these can grow up on your trees. Cut those too. It's just a simple matter of going around with some shears and cutting those, or spraying them. And eventually too, you may need to spray at the bottom with some herbicide, some Roundup, to kill those vines to make sure they don't come back.
Yeah, I've seen that firsthand. The greenbrier up here gets up and wraps around all my trees and cages for sure. Yep. Lindsay, that's some awesome information, and like extremely great. Better than I ever thought it would have came out. So thank you very much. I know we've already had you on for an hour here, and I want to have a quick rapid fire set of questions if you're up for it. And then our number 7 question is going to be one you can think about for a minute before you answer. So,
okay.
All right. Your favorite beverage?
Are we talking adult beverage here, or
Sure, let's do it, because the last 5 people I asked, not one picked an adult beverage. So let's go adult beverage.
Oh man, I'm a bourbon drinker in the winter, and I like gin and tonics in the summer.
Good answers.
But I do also like a good cold beer too. So
all right, he's not picky. I like it.
Let's say this too: the most common beverage for me is coffee. Writers are fueled by a lot of coffee.
I couldn't agree with that more. How about your favorite venison recipe?
Man, it is hard to beat a good grilled backstrap for me. I do a lot of different stuff. Do roasts in the crock pot. I like to fry cube steak. Um, Tons of different things with ground venison, whether it's chili, spaghetti, you name it. But to me, my absolute favorite is just a plain old salt, pepper, and olive oil grilled backstrap.
Amen. Amen. All right. Fixed blade or mechanical broadhead?
I'm going back to I'm going back to fixed this year. I've been on mechanical here for several years now, shooting a Rage. I've had good success with it. But I don't know. I just have a feeling I haven't had a problem with mechanicals. There's been a couple of times I thought they didn't function like I thought they should have. But I don't know whether that's just my imagination or not. I've seen a lot of deer drop in sight, shot through with a mechanical. So I've got faith in mechanicals, but I don't know. I'm starting to think about just going back to old school and go back fixed.
Okay.
Good question.
Yeah, no problem. What do you hunt the most out of? Preset tree stands, blinds, or do you like mobile hunt where you're saddle or climber? Which one do you do the most?
Mostly preset tree stands, whether that's ladder stands and or lock-ons with a stick ladder. That's mostly what I do. Here in the last couple of years, I've started to use ground blinds more. Certainly, 50-something-year-old dude is looking at a ground blind and going, "Man, that's looking mighty sweet," compared to the old climbers and lock-ons. But what it is about half of our farm in southeast Georgia is floodplain swamp, and it's difficult to manage from a timber standpoint. So it's back in that swamp. The higher you get off the ground, the lower your visibility is. And I just started realizing that you have better visibility on the ground many times. So here in the last couple of years, I've started hunting more out of ground blinds in the swamp for that reason. But still, I'd say the majority of my hunting is either from a ladder stand, a climber, or a lock-on.
Okay, this one's going to be a doozy for you. You can only pick one. What do you think is most important? Food, water, or cover? It is kind of it's a tough one.
I mean, I guess it would be food. I'm torn between food and cover.
Mm-hmm.
Deer kind of take care of themselves with water, but
yeah, nobody cares if they get a drink. Everybody's always on the food or cover.
Right.
Because they get their water through the vegetation. But
yeah, and they get their water from the food. So
right.
Yeah, if I got to pick one, I'm going with food.
Okay. Favorite habitat, tool, or implement?
Chainsaw.
All right. And then so far you've passed. Final question. Your favorite tree? We started asking this question maybe like 100 episodes ago, and you some pretty cool stories and answers behind this one.
My favorite tree is a swamp chestnut oak.
Okay.
It is a native tree to the southeast. It's in the white oak family. Looks like a white oak bark, but the leaf looks more like kind of like a chestnut or chinkapin leaf.
Yep.
It's broad with small lobes. But the acorn is enormous. It's a bigger acorn than a white oak. They are huge. It's like a bur oak sized acorn.
Wow.
It's native to floodplains and sandy soils of the southeast. So it's kind of, native to the same soil I'm native to. And just a beautiful tree, huge acorn, and deer absolutely love it. I've had some of my best hunts ever under a swamp chestnut oak that's dropping in November, which it tends to drop in November. And it's just fun to watch a doe try to get her jaws around a swamp chestnut oak acorn. It's neat. They can do it, but it takes some work.
That's awesome. Lindsay, well done today, my friend. It was great catching up with you again. And we'll hope to do some more with you in the future. If there's anything or how the listeners can find you these days, where would you point them or leave any parting words?
You can find me and NDA at deerassociation.com. And of course, we're on all the social media channels at Deer Association, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and now TikTok too, all at Deer Association. So that's the best way to find me in the organization. But listen, thank y'all for having me back again. I'm excited that this is my third trip, and I really am honored that y'all had me back, particularly to talk about this topic. I love trees. I love planting them and growing them and seeing the results that you get. So I love all habitat management, but my passion when it comes to deer habitat is managing trees. So thank you for letting me talk about it.
Thanks for coming
Yeah,
on.
we
We
appreciate
appreciate
it.
you.
Thanks, Lindsay.